The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Welcome back for another episode of Voices in Validation. We are so glad to have you here with us today as we talk about quality assurance and audit trails with Ivan Soto. Ivan is the Director of Manufacturing Validation for Emergent BioSolutions. And I'm happy to have you here today with us, Ivan. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Stacey.
Pleasure to have you. Yeah. Ivan, you've spoken at many of our conferences, and this is always a hot topic, the one we're going to discuss today. We hear so much about data integrity in the pharmaceutical and life sciences arena. And if you didn't know better, you might think that it's a new concept. But in fact, data integrity has always been a basic GXP requirement, and regulators have always performed audits. So why are we hearing more about audits and audit reviews and audit trails today than we have ever in the past?
So, if you look at the history, in recent years, we had a number of different guidance documents published and regulatory requirements published by FDA and other agencies, including MHRA, regarding data integrity and audit trails, specifically audit trail reviews. So this has created a lot of these noise about audit trails and data integrity, and obviously the noise and conversation about doing audit trail reviews.
So I'm glad you mentioned audit trail reviews. I hear a lot of people talk about those who are in the industry. It's something that many professionals kind of are fearful of, having this audit done and not having the correct audit trail or having glitches in the audit trail. So can you talk a little bit about the history of the review portion of, of the audit trails?
Sure.
And how it's changed over time?
Of course. So if you go back to about 2011, that's when the MHRA published Annex 11. And then right. Annex 11 was one of the first documents that was published by a regulatory agency dictating or providing requirements for doing audit trail reviews. So that kind of started the conversation. Prior to that, there was always conversations about doing audit trail reviews, but there was not very specific requirements that I'm aware of. And then when you have Annex 11 coming in, that's when the conversation starts about data integrity, audit trail reviews. This is where there's a lot of, it triggered a lot of conversation and audits, internal audits and external audits about this area of compliance, and that's how everything started going back to 2011. Right after that, you have a bunch of different guidance documents that came out, and including FDA, obviously Europe put also their guidance documents as well. The WHO put another document on data integrity. So you had a bunch of different documents coming out of after the 2011 time period of Annex 11 being published, and all these documents started talking and defining the requirements for doing audit trail reviews.
Right, and so there's challenges just in the document. So there's so many different documents. Many of them are changed periodically. What are some of the other challenges with the implementation of a good audit trail review process?
So to do an audit trail review process, and the problem is right now the industry continues to struggle on understanding what they need to do. You have a bunch of different documents out there that are saying do it, but they don't really tell you how much or effort and what you need to do with the different type of audit trails, right? This takes a strategic approach to looking at audit trails and the implementation of audit trails, and basically putting a strategy in place. And a lot of companies are struggling on doing that right now, and they
Okay.
continue to struggle because they struggle on how to define the frequency of the audit trails and so on.
So is it fair to say there's these guidance documents out there, but they're not very clear in terms of the steps that you need to take and the exact things you need to do? Rather, it just kind of suggests that you need to follow a process, but what the
Yes,
process is isn't really defined. Is that correct?
yes, yes.
Yeah.
To a significant extent, yes.
So, to folks in the industry know that it is extremely critical to have audit review process. You know, the safety, efficacy, reliability of pharmaceuticals and patient safety are critical to everyone who's working in the industry and who's participating in it, whether a patient, et cetera. So can you describe then, with that being the case, why audit trails are important to that goal and how this really impacts data integrity efforts altogether?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the thing here is that we generate a significant amount of data regarding the product quality with electronic systems. So you go to the QC labs where you do testing for releasing the product, and obviously this testing is based on meeting a specification for a critical quality attribute. So the integrity of that data is extremely important because the quality of the product is defined by the integrity of that data. So if the integrity of the data is in question, now we obviously need to put a big question mark on the product quality as well. So that's the reason the audit trails are very important because they provide you a baseline of information about the integrity of the data, the type of manipulation that was done to that data during the life cycle of the data, and whether the data has gone through manipulations that are questionable enough to be able to put a potential concern on data integrity. And then obviously that extrapolates to the product because let's say that you have a company that might be involved in business that is not very well aligned with GMP compliance, and now they have product that doesn't meet the specifications in the lab. Now they decide to play with the data, manipulate the data beyond what is allowed per regulations and procedures, and now that data all of a sudden becomes good. It passes. You can release the product when, in fact, the data and the quality of the product is compromised. So this is where it's really extremely important. So the audit trail reviews bring into the picture the ability to be able to detect any data integrity compromises by looking at the audit trail review and saying, is this data adequate? Does the audit trail indicate some potential manipulation of data that could be deemed as an issue from a data integrity perspective? And if the data is good, then we release the results and move forward. So this is where it's really extremely important because the quality of your data is proportional to the quality of your product. So if one of them is compromised, you obviously have a big question in the quality of the product, and you don't want that to be compromised by any means.
Right. No, and that definitely makes sense. And so I'm hearing what you're saying. And it seems as though it's not just the data that you have as a pharmaceutical company that you're working with today, but it's also the historical data, right? So the legacy of the entire product life cycle comes into question. And why is it important then to assess the data from, way back? Why is
Oh
it
well,
that is so important?
it's extremely important because throughout the life cycle, you need to maintain adequate data integrity, even from the early stages of the development of the process, because you will be moving that product or molecule across the entire life cycle of the product to different stages of the life cycle, where the level of requirements as it relates to data integrity are very critical, and also is to preserve the history from a life cycle perspective as it relates to that product. So if the data integrity is in question, then how can you rely on that data and historical information when you're looking at issues related to an investigation, related to a deviation that you have with the product because you have an out of specification result, you're having an issue with the manufacturing process, and so on. And also from a tech transfer perspective, when you're transferring these processes from one location to the other, and normally you transfer from process development to commercialization, the integrity of that data is absolutely critical for the transfer to be adequate and in alignment with GMPs, and obviously to be effective as well.
So when reviewers are coming in, they want to see the mistakes. They want to see the mistakes that have been corrected and exactly how that has happened. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So
you don't want to hide that stuff, right? And that's what you could do when you manipulate data, right? And then if you don't look at the audit trails, you don't look at the audit trail review, how are you going to know that that data was manipulated to the point that it was altered to make it look something else?
Right. And it's a slippery slope, I understand, when you're put in that position. So it's best just to document everything as accurately as you can, and show your process along the way. And that being said, I did want to ask you, because it sounds like there's no hard and fast guideline or rule for how to capture this data, except that you need to do it. So in your experiences, what's needed to implement an adequate audit trail review system or program?
Yeah, so the one of the biggest challenges right now is that companies are going out there and struggling to implement an adequate process for audit trail review. So then in some cases, the quality organization is saying, go ahead and implement. We're expecting you to align with these requirements. We don't know how you're going to do it, but you need to do it. The business is saying, okay, now I have to go in and do it. And then in many cases, they end up compromising and putting procedure to do audit trail reviews that are meaningless. Mm-hmm. Meaningless because they don't have an adequate process. Meaningless because the audit trail reviews are not adequate to be able to do an objective assessment of data integrity when you're reviewing that data. And then the other struggle that companies have is whether they do it on one frequency or the other, and what is an adequate frequency. So one problem that I've seen is that a lot of companies go out and do a one-size-fits-all approach, right? But not all data is created equal, because different data types have different levels of risk depending on the impact to the product quality and the safety of the product. So all that need to be taken into account. Okay, so in order for you to go out and look at implementing audit trail review, my recommendation is, first of all, do an assessment of your audit trails against the current regulatory requirements and your own requirements of what you need to see on the audit trail to be able to do an objective assessment of data integrity. One is to meet the minimum requirement of the law. Two is to meet your own requirements of what you need in that audit trail to provide you for you to be able to do an assessment that is adequate. Second is, once you do that assessment, you're going to have a population of systems that have adequate audit trails. You're going to have a population of systems that have audit trails that are okay. You're going to have a population of systems that the audit trails are inadequate, right? So at that point, you're going to have to make decisions. You cannot fix everything at the same time. There's never enough money on this industry to go ahead and do the whole enchilada at the same time. So then you're going to have to take a risk-based approach and say, out of my population of audit trails that are inadequate, which ones are the higher risk? Okay, right. And that population is the one that you're going to remediate first, because that data is high risk because it's related to product quality, it's related to the stability program, it's related to pharmacovigilance or something else. But you need to slice the cake in pieces. Otherwise, it's going to be an overwhelming, very expensive effort that may end up being something that is meaningless. And you don't want to sign up for that because it's going to take resources and money to do it. And when you
Right.
throw
So
in
you're
resources and
prioritizing based on
yes,
risk to the patient and risk to the product. Yes. Right.
absolutely. And then the second piece to this is once you know what you have in terms of the population of audit trails, and then obviously doing your remediation, opening your CAPAs, I highly suggest that you put a remediation plan in place where you talk about what you're doing, which systems are going to be done first, and what are your intervening controls are you going to implement to compensate for what you don't have on the audit trails as well, right? Because you could always compensate with some procedure controls as well. But this needs to be done
Right.
because otherwise you're going to go blindly into committing resources, time, and money into something that might not be adequate and might not meet the intent of the regulatory requirement, and that might end up being a meaningless exercise. My other recommendation, along with what we just discussed, is you're going to look at your population of audit trails. Your implementation need to be risk-based. So again, not all data is created equal. Not all data carries the same level of risk. Then you need to do a risk assessment. And normally the risk of the data is proportional to the risk of the system. Okay, so if you go by that premise, a high risk system has high risk data. Those are the systems that I need to remediate first. Therefore, those are the systems that I need to implement auditory reviews as a priority, and you take a phase approach. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very overwhelming as well. In addition to that, once you sort this out, you understand, you do your remediation, you put your remediation plan in place, you open the CAPAs, then you need to create a procedure for audit trail reviews. And ideally, you want to have one procedure for the entire site that speaks to this generic process approach to audit trails. And this you need to slice based on risk, right? High
Right.
risk systems, I review more frequently. Lower risk systems, I review on a lower frequency. But the high risk systems normally are going to be your manufacturing systems, right? You're making the product with them, or
Sure.
the systems that you're using to test the product. So my recommendation in those cases is if you have an adequate audit trail, the review of the audit trail gets done with the data related to that specific data set. I have QC data to release the product and do disposition on the product related to the CQAs. I have a spec. I want to see that audit trail the moment that I'm reviewing that data to make sure that there's no data integrity issues related to the release of that product and product quality. Likewise, if I have electronic batch records and I have an audit trail related that electronic batch record, the moment I have my QA quality group reviewing the batch record, the audit trail should be embedded with that. Now, lower risk systems, you could do that as part of your periodic review of the system and then do it based on risk, right? Lower risk systems, you do it less frequently, but it needs to be a risk-based approach.
Okay. So I want see if we can flesh out the intervals or the frequency a little bit more for the listeners, because it sounds like it's very individualized for organizations in terms of the processes you have in place and the level of risk. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
do you have recommendations or standards that are typical in terms of intervals? So how frequently they should be reviewing, doing audit trail reviews, and what exactly should they be looking for as they're going about that review?
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, so if I was going to give you a recommendation, I would say that um, data audit trails related to QC testing on critical quality attributes that are used to release the product, you want to review that audit trail every time that you are auditing that data
Okay.
before you release the results.
Sure.
Okay, so that can be embedded as part of the QA review of those results. So, and then similarly, those ones that are related to electronic batch records are the type of audit trails that you want to review on a more frequent basis. And normally you want to do those when you're releasing the batch records as well and releasing the lot of the product. Now, data related to lower risk systems, electronic document management systems, training systems, and so on, those systems are lower risk. So you don't need to review those audit trails every time you generate the data or you're going to sign off on some kind of QA review of those type of records because they don't have a direct impact on the product. So I'm kind of giving you on a spectrum from the higher risk to the lower risk.
Sure, and that makes sense, right? That you'd pay more attention to the highest risk systems within your organization. And it sounds like it's good practice just to do a quick audit trail review every time you hit a benchmark. Is that fair?
For critical high risk data, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And that's actually an easier plan, I would think, for an organization to get on board with because it's not random. You know what I mean? It's very customized.
Absolutely. It's a little more a strategic implementation plan than a reactive plan.
Right.
And that's what you want to avoid here, overreactions to the requirements of audit trail reviews and data integrity requirements. And because the overreactions are going to kill you and they're going to add expenses and require resources that you throw in as something that is meaningless, and you don't want to do that.
Right. No, I would agree, especially for smaller or emerging companies, right? Who are trying
Absolutely.
Product to market, and this is an added expense for them, but one that's necessary. I mean, it is requirements. You have to follow the requirements of the FDA, I should say, or other regulators, regulatory bodies. So, so simplifying the process for them is very helpful. I would think. So I do appreciate the tips you provided. Where do you see the whole industry moving to in regards to audit trails? I hear a lot about, companies going paperless. And then, of course, we are seeing a lot more automation and come in. Internet of Things is playing a big role, as is robotics and artificial intelligence. And all of that is going to impact the process for defining your audit trail systems and ultimately the reviews. So can you talk a little bit about where you kind of see everything going as we...
So absolutely. Yeah, so I think we're not going to get away from the conversation on audit trails and audit trail reviews because we head into digitalization and we're talking about Pharma 0.0. We are going to continue to increase the use of electronic systems in the industry. That's not going away, and that means audit trails are not going away. So what I see in the future is that hopefully companies are going to mature on their understanding of what they need to do as it relates to audit trail reviews. And we will continue to have subject matter experts speaking to the topic and obviously providing adequate strategies that are based on real life experiences and not just based on philosophy and ideology, because it is very important to separate both. Okay.
Right.
One thing is to have a philosophical point of view and approach to do audit trail reviews. But it's not very aligned with reality, right? And the practicality and the logic of the intent of the law and the regulatory requirement. So is that we will evolve. Audit trails will get better because companies are going to understand what they need over time, and that will put pressure on vendors to provide adequate audit trails. And then I see a light on the tunnel where as we continue to educate the industry about this topic, we will continue to see an increased maturity level on the approach and better strategies on the implementation of audit trail reviews.
That makes sense. And I would think it's going to continue to evolve over time, just as all of these technologies are. And how do you think that, so looking forward into the future, I know many companies, larger companies, have begun the full integration of Pharma 4.0 into their practices, while smaller companies are still yet to really approach it. So from the audit trail review perspective, but also just from being an expert, subject matter expert working in validation yourself. How do you think that are we going to be able to close that gap, I guess, is where I'm going with that, between where the large companies are and where the small companies are, and everybody sort of needs to migrate in the same direction? So can you talk?
In my own expert opinion, I would say that there's always going to be a big difference. Okay. The big pharma guys have the money to spend and the resources and the people to throw at these issues. Doesn't mean that they put the best strategies to address these problems, right?
Right.
Because money doesn't resolve an issue if you don't have a good strategy. Now, you're always going to have a big difference with the smaller companies because the problem is that they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, so they play catch up. I think that given my experience on both sides of the fence, and what I see out there in the industry today, I think the smaller companies are really doing a true, honest, genuine effort of catching up. And catching up with the requirements of doing audit trail reviews and meeting the requirements on a data integrity perspective. From a pharma 4.0, I think it's a long shot before smaller companies can get to that point, if they ever get to that point.
Right.
Because a lot of these companies still relying on hybrid systems and a lot of paper processes as well.
So, and that's right. And so we know that people are trying to move away from doing that. But I guess the bottom line in terms of what we're talking about today with the audit trail review systems is that no matter what size company you are, you need to put your best foot forward and come up with the best processes you can. Make sure that you know what you as an organization need to be doing to produce the best product you can. And it's about the quality rather than the quantity, right?
Absolutely. And it's the strategy. It's extremely important to have an adequate strategy.
Right.
And not overreact to the requirements and be able to be smart about it.
Great. So I think that's the takeaway for today for folks working in the industry who are directly responsible for the systems and preparing for the reviews. So in parting, could you just leave our listeners with a couple of tips or tidbits from your experience in terms of best practices and things that they can do today to ensure that their systems are the best they can be?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, make sure that you understand the audit trails, the population of audit trails that you have at your site before you commit to do audit trail reviews. Remediate what doesn't look right. Put frequencies in place that are risk-based, and be smart about it. Don't overreact. You don't need to go crazy. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Ivan. Some great information today came from this conversation. I really appreciate your time. And for our listeners out there, Ivan is a subject matter expert who does a lot of speaking and writing. So for more of his articles and discussions, you can visit ivtnetwork.com. But until then, Ivan, I thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I'll also big shout out to Ed Sullivan, our producer. And thanks again to Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. To our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends and colleagues. You can find out more by visiting ivtnetwork.com or emailing customer service at ivtnetwork.com. And join us again next week for another great episode of Voices in Validation.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its